This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that reached a point where it can no longer hear itself think, a system that no longer persuades. It only applies pressure. Quietly, methodically, it crossed a line most people never notice in real time. Not the moment of violence, the moment when violence became the default language. You were told this kind of collapse is loud, chaotic, obvious. It isn't. It happens behind closed networks, during silences, in gaps where information disappears and authority stops explaining itself. And once that shift happens, everything changes at once. Legitimacy, economics, foreign policy, even time itself starts to move faster. If you want to understand how systems fail before they fall, stay with me, because what looks sudden later always begins slowly. And the mechanism that made this possible is already in motion. When systems like this break, people look for villains, faces, names, speeches to blame. That instinct is comforting, and it's wrong. What actually controls the system now is not ideology, not charisma, not belief. It's inertia. A machine built to preserve itself after persuasion stopped working. When consent failed, it substituted force. When force failed, it scaled. At that point, no one is really deciding anymore. Orders move because the system requires them to move. Budgets flow because stopping them would expose weakness. Silence becomes policy because explanation creates risk. This is how a state stops governing and starts managing threat. Not external threat, internal. Citizens become variables. Crowds become liabilities. And every response is designed not to solve the problem, but to prevent the system from admitting it has one. Once a system reaches that stage, it doesn't calm down. It narrows. It hardens. And the most dangerous changes are the ones that feel procedural. Because what happens next doesn't look like a decision. It looks like routine. There was a time when force was a last resort. Exceptional, temporary. Now it's scheduled. That shift didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived through normalization, through repetition, through the quiet lowering of thresholds, before disruptions were contained, negotiated, explained after the fact. Now explanation is treated as vulnerability. Networks go dark. Information slows. Visibility itself becomes the threat. This is the most dangerous phase of any system under stress. Not panic, familiarity. When extraordinary measures become standard operating procedure, the system stops asking whether it should act, only whether it can act faster next time. And each cycle compresses the next. Shorter warnings, heavier tools, less distinction between control and punishment. To people inside the system, this feels like efficiency. To those outside it, it feels like chaos. But the truth sits somewhere colder. A system that learns it can act without being seen will always act more. Not because it wants to, because nothing stops it. And once invisibility works once, it becomes strategy. That's when the consequences stop being local. Here's where the abstraction breaks. Because when systems shift this far, the evidence doesn't come from speeches. It comes from places that don't speak publicly at all, hospitals. What emerged slowly and then all at once were reports from inside emergency rooms. Not commentary, not ideology, clinical observation, doctors describing a sudden change in the injuries they were treating, not crowd control wounds, not dispersal tactics, war injuries, military-grade ammunition, machine gun fire. Volume so overwhelming that triage stopped being a medical decision and became a mathematical one. And the timing mattered. The injuries changed after the networks went dark, after visibility disappeared. That's not coincidence. That's sequence. The system didn't lose control. It adjusted inputs once oversight was removed. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be processed. Facilities designed to heal became sites of documentation. Doctors became witnesses whether they wanted to or not. If this were just chaos, it would be uneven. If this were panic, it would be sloppy. What they described was neither. It was organized. If you're still with me, stay. Because this wasn't the crisis, it was the signal. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Systems like this don't collapse because of violence. They collapse because of allocation. Who absorbs risk? Who is insulated from consequence? And who benefits from delay? At the center, authority narrows. Decision-making compresses upward. Responsibility does the opposite. It diffuses. Orders are fragmented just enough that no single actor feels ownership of the outcome. Each unit executes a piece. Each layer claims procedure. No one claims intent. Those closest to power gain protection. Access, silence. Those farther out absorb the damage, physically, economically, psychologically. This is how a system converts violence into stability, temporarily. It spends human cost to buy time, and time is the real currency here. Time to reshuffle loyalty, time to test international response, time to see what level of force triggers pushback and what level doesn't. Every action becomes a probe, every escalation a data point. The danger isn't that the system is out of control. The danger is that it's learning. And once learning replaces restraint, the next crisis isn't accidental, it's engineered. Then the pressure moves outward. Not as an announcement, as friction. Markets hesitate, transactions slow, risk models change their assumptions overnight. Suddenly, doing nothing becomes expensive. External actors don't respond because of outrage. They respond because instability leaks. It contaminates supply chains, energy flows, strategic calculations. Economic measures appear first, not as punishment, as containment, tariffs, restrictions, signals aimed not at behavior, but at acceleration. At the same time, something else happens. Movement, aircraft reposition, assets shift, readiness increases without explanation. This isn't intervention yet, it's posture. And posture is a language systems understand very well. The internal system reads this not as pressure to stop, but as confirmation that the clock has started. That's when escalation becomes rational, not because collapse is desired, because hesitation now carries higher risk than force. This is the phase where miscalculation stops being theoretical, where every move tightens the corridor of possible outcomes, and the system, having already committed to invisibility, has fewer exits than it realizes. What that means for people caught inside it is where this becomes personal. This is where you come in, not as a spectator, as a variable. Because systems like this don't just reshape borders or governments. They rewrite the cost of ordinary life. When visibility disappears, uncertainty takes its place. Prices rise before explanations do. Jobs pause. Money hesitates. Families stop planning months ahead and start planning days. You feel it in small decisions. What you buy, what you postpone, what you avoid saying out loud. Information becomes unreliable, then unavailable. Rumors carry more weight than statements. Silence feels intentional. And the psychological shift is the real damage. You stop asking what's true. You start asking what's safe. That's not an accident. That's the downstream effect of a system that governs through pressure instead of consent. If you're watching this, you're already doing something rare. You're staying present while the picture is incomplete. Stay with me, because the people who pay the highest price in these moments are always the last ones consulted. And what happens next won't stay contained where it started. This is the moment when the system stops being local, because pressure never respects borders. It follows connections. Trade routes feel it first. Energy markets next. Then diplomacy starts speaking in contingency language instead of policy. Other governments don't need certainty to react. They only need probability of disruption, probability of spillover, probability that waiting costs more than acting. And once that threshold is crossed, neutrality erodes. Allies recalibrate quietly. Rivals test limits carefully. Everyone starts preparing for outcomes they won't name publicly. This is how internal repression becomes an international problem. Not through morality, through exposure. A system that relies on invisibility can't operate indefinitely in a connected world. Data leaks, images surface, signals contradict official narratives, and each contradiction forces external systems to choose: engage, contain, or prepare for rupture. None of those choices are clean. All of them carry cost. That's why uncertainty becomes the dominant condition. Not panic, not resolve, uncertainty. And uncertainty is the environment where acceleration thrives. Because once the global system starts moving, it rarely moves in straight lines. Which brings us to what happens next. From here, there are only three directions the system can move. Not outcomes. Paths. The first is adjustment. The system absorbs the shock. It reduces visibility selectively, concedes just enough to slow pressure without changing structure. Force remains but becomes quieter. The surface stabilizes. The mechanism stays intact. The second is erosion. Pressure doesn't break the system. It thins it. Defections increase. Coordination weakens. Orders still move, but compliance becomes uneven. The system continues functioning while losing coherence. Collapse becomes gradual, messy, hard to date. The third is rupture. Acceleration outpaces control. External pressure intersects with internal fracture. Decisions compress too fast. Mistakes compound. The system loses the ability to modulate force, only to deploy it. None of these paths announce themselves clearly. They overlap. They masquerade as one another. That's why prediction fails here. Not because analysts lack data, because the system itself hasn't chosen yet. And systems under this level of stress don't choose deliberately. They drift until they can't, which is why what happens next isn't a conclusion. It's a question. There's a temptation at this point to look for reassurance, for a clean ending, for a signal that someone somewhere has regained control. That signal isn't coming because systems don't fail with clarity. They fail with momentum. What you're watching isn't a story about resolution. It's a story about thresholds being crossed quietly, one after another, until reversal becomes impossible. The most dangerous moment isn't the collapse itself. It's the period just before, when every actor believes there's still time. Time to wait. Time to hedge. Time to see what happens next. That's how acceleration hides. Inside patience. If this system stabilizes, it will do so by becoming harder, narrower, and more expensive for everyone involved. If it erodes, the damage will spread without a single breaking point. And if it ruptures, it won't ask permission first. None of those outcomes require bad intentions, only systems that learn to substitute force for legitimacy. If you want to understand where this goes, don't look for announcements. Watch the silences. Watch what stops being explained. And stay with this story, because the next phase won't begin loudly. It will begin when people stop pretending this is temporary.